Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. I know some of you might be shocked at my appearance. Yes, the beard is gone. I have reclaimed a certain space of real estate, specifically my face, and the chin that my 15-year-old son calls the butt chin is back. Actually, I'm feeling great, and hopefully people are not offended by seeing more of my face and less of the hair that was on it. Okay, one other thing I want to mention, and I know we've brought this up a few times, but just a note of thanks to those of you who have supported the show by subscribing on YouTube. We just exceeded 2,000 subscribers, which to me is just unbelievable in such a short period of time. Devin and I are just very, very, very grateful to those of you who support the show. And by way of thanks, we're going to continue to produce content that you like, that you enjoy, and that's edifying. And in that vein, we have another wonderful guest today. I'm very pleased to have a man who can talk on a variety of very intriguing and interesting topics in Canadian politics and culture, and also someone who is a friend and someone who was one of the very special people who reached out to me during a very difficult time a couple of years ago when I had my cancel culture experience. And his name is Peter Holle. He is the founder and head of an incredible organization called the Frontier Center for Public Policy. And thanks to Peter, I've been made a senior fellow of that think tank. We're going to talk about think tanks and what they are. I didn't really know much about think tanks before I met Peter, but I'm very pleased to be part of Frontier. It's opened up a whole new vista for me in terms of intellectual expression and knowledge, and also I've got to meet a number of really great people, several of whom have been guests on this program, including people like Preston Manning and Brian Peckford, and we're going to be hearing from another man upcoming named David Lease, and of course here we have Peter Holle. So before we talk with him in more in-depth way, now that I've wet your whistle, as we always do, we're going to turn to the aphorism board. And in honor of our guest today, I've got a few that I hopefully he will be pleased with. The first one is from the famous French author Albert Camus, who once famously wrote, "The welfare of humanity is always the alibi of tyrants." Next, we have Plato. The price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. And finally, from Edmund Burke, who is considered by many to be sort of one of the grandfathers of conservatism, Irish philosopher, who wrote this: "People crushed by laws, like COVID laws, have no hope but to evade power. If the laws are their enemies, they'll be enemies to the law, and those who have most to hope and nothing to lose will always be dangerous." Okay, so who do we have on the show? Well, as we said, we've got Peter Holle. Who is Peter Holle? Peter Holle is the founder and president of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. We're going to find out more about what that is and what it does. He's an award-winning Western Canadian-based public policy thinker, and he's part of this think tank. Since its founding in 1997, the Frontier has brought a distinctive and influential Prairie voice to regional and national debates over public policy in areas such as core public sector reform, housing, poverty, aboriginals, consumer-focused healthcare performance, equalization, boy, that's a dirty word in Alberta right now, rural policy, and much more. Of the nearly 100 organized think tanks in Canada, Frontier is one of only 5 to make the 2008 Global Go-To Think Tanks list published by the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Peter has worked extensively with public sector reform and has provided advisory services to various governments across Canada and the U.S. His publications, some of which we're going to talk about today, have appeared in various newspapers and journals, including dozens of newspapers, the National Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He's a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's a member of various organizations, including the Mont Pelerin Society, an international organization of classical liberals. So, Peter, welcome to the program.
Great to be here, Leighton.
been a long time coming. Mostly my fault. We have a few scheduling snafus. I want to tell you how grateful we are to the Frontier for feeding us a steady stream of just excellent guests. Of course, there's a great bullpen of intellectual talent there at the Frontier, yourself included. But I just want to say thanks for the support of the Frontier to the program and to me personally over the past year or so.
Well, Leighton, your podcast is excellent, and I have to congratulate you. I'm not surprised you have 2,000 subscribers. It is, really great podcasts that you do, and I never miss it. It's on my to-do list, and they're a little long, so they end up on the when we're driving out to the cottage for an hour and a half. They fit perfectly.
Well, I'm glad you're able to fit them comfortably into your lifestyle. That's wonderful to hear. So let's go back a little bit in your history. Now, I've sort of given this brief bio, and people can find that on the Frontier Center website on the Frontier. And by the way, if anybody who has never visited that website, wow, do you ever have some undiscovered country? This is just a bounty of information for anybody who's never seen this. I can remember the first time I visited, I was probably on there for 3 or 4 hours, just reading through all the archive stuff, just brilliant articles. Some of really the smartest people in Canada and really in the Western world contributing articles there. And it's carefully curated, and in part, this man is responsible for that. But Peter, could you go back into your history a little bit and tell us how you first became involved with the Frontier? This is going all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. Can you cast your mind back that far?
Well, I can. I'll go back to my university days. I ended up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I fell in with some people who were fans of Ayn Rand, and there was if you know Ayn Rand, the individual versus the collective, and so on. And I ended up in Saskatchewan, and at the time it was the early 80s, and there was a recession. The government had just changed in Saskatchewan from Alan Blakeney of the NDP to Grant Devine of the Conservatives, and so there was quite a buzz, and I ended up going back to Saskatchewan, and I was the junior policy analyst in a think tank inside the government of Saskatchewan. And if you know how governments are structured, you have central agencies, the Public Service Commission, the Treasury Board, and then Executive Council, which was the department of the cabinet, had its own internal think tank. And I was the junior guy there. So it was quite an interesting experience to be at the interface between the bureaucracy and the politicians. And I ended up, I was an impatient right-wing guy at the time. And if you remember back then, the time of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and also there was upheaval in other places like New Zealand, which I'd like to talk about that if you don't mind either.
Yeah.
And I was one of the young Turks that was pushing to, why does the government own crown corporations? What are we doing here? Why does the government own a potash mine? Why does it own an oil company? Why does it own a bus company? And to make a long story short, eventually there was an internal privatization unit, and I was part of that. And it was a great opportunity. We met all sorts of key people in this new field of restructuring government and privatizing government assets. And I ended up, part of that effort. And if you recall, Grant Devine's government ended up selling off several crown corporations. And at the end of the day, he had a government that was struggling with recessions. He had 3 recessions in 2 terms, and eventually he did lose. I ended up I got married. My wife was transferred to Winnipeg, and I found myself in Winnipeg. And back in my privatization days, I had the pleasure of working with the beginning of the taxpayer movement in Canada. If you remember, the predecessor to the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, there were taxpayer organizations in Saskatchewan, Alberta. And since I was in Manitoba, the founder at the time said, "Hey, why don't you run the Manitoba Taxpayers Association?" Which I did. And again, that was an interesting experience. It was if you recall, the early 90s was the time of the taxpayers being unhappy. You saw the beginning of the Reform Party. Mm-hmm. You had Paul Martin. Give him lots of credit. He read the landscape properly, and they made big cuts to government spending. And ironically, Canada then had many years of surpluses, and the fastest growth in the G7 and so on, which confirmed the idea that governments need to be smaller if you want to have growth and if you want to have a higher living standard. Mm-hmm. But I was in Winnipeg, and we ended up pushing through a balanced budget law, which at the time was quite radical in Canada. The Filmon government ran on it. They were reelected, and it was quite a victory for the taxpayers. And I then ended up, I did. There was a transition, and I left the taxpayers. And what happened was I was approached by a foundation, and the foundation was run by an American director. And she said that Canada's public policy was remarkably mediocre, and that in the United States, what they do to mix
How can
things
something be remarkable and mediocre at the same time? That seems like an oxymoron, Peter.
Well, so again, she said that the Americans had a tradition of independent think tanks.
Right.
Could not be funded by the government because government funding will compromise you, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up with the foundation approached me and offered me a substantial startup grant and said, "Why don't you start a think tank?" And I said, "Well, okay." And I had, this was all kind of new business to me, but I think they were comfortable with my natural skepticism towards government, that government needs to do certain things well. Our problem today is governments do way too many things. They do lots of things in a very poor, mediocre way. Okay, mm-hmm. So I think they rolled the dice on me, offered me the startup grant. I had to go figure out really quick how to take advantage of the money. You had to go get charitable status and so on. And again, I created a rainbow board of directors. I had NDP on my board. I had Liberals on my board. I had Conservatives on the board.
Diversity.
Yes, it was. And I remember, we had a lobby going on in Ottawa because it was very hard to get charitable status. And so on April Fool's Day, 1999, ironically, I got a phone call from Herb Dollywall's personal assistant, and Herb Dollywall was the Minister of Natural
I
Revenue.
remember that name. Yes.
Yes, and the call went, well, Mr. Holle, call off the dogs. You have your status, okay? And that was the beginning of Frontier Center, and you know, here we were in Winnipeg, and you know, we basically said, okay, well, the space in the market was the prairies, and we ended up, you know, Frontier then had a presence in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan eventually. And no, we had a very good run, and I, you know, we're still there. You know, it is intellectual missionary work, uh, and you know, we can talk about the Overton window. Basically, what has happened is that the frame of reference for public policy has shifted sharply to the left, the
Mm-hmm.
woke left. So the things that we could say without any problem, you know, 15 years ago, today is just seen as very dangerous talk. But again, because we are not government funded, and you know, the whole point of the independent think tank is that you have the ability to resist the temptations. And I can, you know, there are lots of think tanks that make the mistake of getting involved with government, and they eventually pour so much water in their wine, Leighton, that you know, they just don't make any difference. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so that's where we are now. I don't know, probably took too long to get there, but that's how Frontier started.
So, one of the fundamental pillars of the frontier, as you've said, is not to accept government funding. Um, and that seems to be a very important part of what you do. I wonder if you could talk about that and also explain, maybe take a step back and explain to those of us who maybe don't have a clear understanding of what a think tank is and what its purpose is. Maybe explain a little bit about that. And also, I know you were saying off camera before we started, you were talking about the distinction between the more highly developed and better funded think tanks in the U.S. and how they operate versus, you know, what the frontier is able to do. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, think tanks are essentially ideas factories, and you know, the idea that, you know, ideas have consequences, and you know, we can talk about what makes a successful government, what makes a successful country, what are the principles we can learn from, how can we apply them here, and what Frontier has done is we'll look around the world, we'll find examples of best practices, we'll find successful healthcare systems or whatever, and then say, well, how might we learn from that? How might we bring that to Canada? And you know, it is, you know, a bit of a cliche, but you know, we're not right wing, we're not left wing. You know, we have a view on what is the proper role of government. You know, government should be, you know, there are core competence things that government should be doing, but certainly they shouldn't be running commercial enterprises. And you can see that today in you know, how the federal government is operating airports and so on. That it's basically a crap show, and there are good reasons for that. You know, government should be you know, limited in scope and in size, and they should do what only governments can do. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and we can talk about that. In the United States, the let's call it the public policy landscape is much more, let's say, interesting and dynamic in the sense that there are plenty of independent think tanks. And again, if you're a big capitalist player in the United States, for heaven's sakes, you don't give your money to the universities, because the universities are where all the bad ideas are coming from.
Right.
You give it to the let's call them classical liberal or market oriented think tanks. And you go to Washington, there's Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, Competitive Enterprise Institute. These are places where they have very high powered thinkers, top brains, and they're involved in the war on ideas, and they are generating ideas that eventually seep into the political process. Um, you know, certainly if you're a congressman in Washington, um, you'll tend to look for people that have some connection to, let's say, the Heritage Foundation. That's the biggest conservative think tank in Washington, and you know, Heritage will bring in dozens and dozens of students, pay them room and board. They don't get paid, but what they end up with is Heritage Foundation on their resume, and they basically it's a ticket into the congressperson's office, let's say, and so we have I would say a much more educated political infrastructure because of that. In Canada, we have, there are some very great, good think tanks. But if you add up their budgets, I don't know, I'm guessing 20, $25 million, $30 million. And on the other side, the universities and so on, and the government funded think tanks, you probably have billions of dollars being spent. So, again, it is an issue. Canada, if I was advising the capitalist classes, they should be investing heavily in groups that, would be thinking like Frontier in terms of, creating high performance policy, good government, and so on. So
this is an interesting topic, and actually one that we discussed a little bit when Preston Manning was on our program. And of course, Preston is a wonderful metaphorical speaker, and he had this analogy of when his grandsons are good hockey players and they played at a high level. And Preston noticed that wherever they went, all the rinks, there were always scouts looking for the young stars and catching them up at young ages. And he lamented the fact that sadly and conspicuously, the same sort of process is not happening in the political milieu, so that we really don't have, as you described, we're not, our political types, our political organizations, political parties are not developing, young thinkers and mining these best ideas the way, for example, the Heritage Foundation is in the U.S. And Preston thinks that this is one of the things that's contributing significantly to, let's say, the lack of political discourse in Canada, and the paucity of new and exciting ideas that would change, and that would help solve some of the serious political problems and economic problems and cultural, social problems that we've had in Canada for a long time that seem insoluble. But Preston thinks, and I agree, that maybe we're not working hard enough on those solutions by developing people and developing minds that can help solve these problems. Would you agree somewhat with that analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I can point to student interns that were at Frontier Center, and they have ended up in very let's say substantive places in universities and also in the public policy world. And again, they come equipped with ideas that they pick up from the think tank, and we just don't have that. So you will have a politician who, where is that politician getting policy advice from? Well, it's from a civil servant that's been there for 100 years, that has no incentive to innovate or rock the boat. And of course, what do we end up with? We end up with the status quo in concrete, basically. Mm-hmm. And Canada it has everything going for it, but you know what? You're sort of recycling tired old ideas from the 1970s and 1980s. Well, guess what? You're just not going to go anywhere, um, we can see what's going on. I have a theory that and I'm sure we want to get into COVID at some point, but how did governments end up doing something as catastrophically stupid as closing their economy over basically the flu? Okay, and when I go back to my times as a senior advisor in the policy world in Saskatchewan, um, uh, had someone come into the office and said, "Hey, we don't know what's going on. There's this flu. Our idea is to collapse the economy." We would have literally picked that person up and thrown them out the door. And say, are you crazy? But it happened. Okay, and I just look at it and go, are you kidding? We now have we all knew it would be a disaster, and we have all the numbers on the disaster. Um, but you saw the entire political machine go down this path, and it was a total fiasco. The biggest fiasco in of our time.
Mhm.
Okay, and the bizarre thing is, there's still people who think that we should be doing it again. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, but again, it is, we need to have better policy capacity in government. Um, the universities right now are not a place for new ideas and innovative thinking at all.
Mhm.
The ideas are toxic and the opposite of what you need to do to be a successful, flourishing society. Well, the answer is you need to find your ideas in other places. And again, the independent think tanks in the U.S. are the go-to places for this. And again, places like Frontier certainly, we can, we have the networks and the gateway and so on. We can share these ideas here. But again, the politicians are they uh, you know they're talking to kind of the machine, and the machine is either captured by other groups or it's to do as little as possible. So
This is a very intriguing example you've raised about COVID. And I think it raises a prime example of the work that a think tank like the Frontier could be doing in terms of solving real world problems. I'm thinking of, specifically of a mutual friend of ours, Colonel Redmond, who is an expert witness in the Ingram case that I've been involved in Alberta, and also a contributor, regular contributor to the
yeah,
Frontier. So here's a man with a lifetime of experience, a real expert in emergency management and policy, and he is completely ignored. He's exactly the kind of person that a government could turn to as a, let's say, a product of a think tank, and the government simply turns a blind eye, or says talk to the hand, and it goes back into an echo chamber and talks to people like, I don't know, Dr. Hinshaw, Brett Rusin, people who really are not in any sense of the word people I would describe as thinkers. So what's behind that? What's going on? Is that part of a preservation of power? They want to ignore any sort of sources of ideas that might question what's going on in the echo chamber?
it's really hard to say, Leighton. And again, David Redmond is the go-to guy on emergency preparedness, and
Mm.
has a uh, lots of very credible experience. And um, you know, I don't know if I don't think you've had him on your program yet,
I
but
tried. I tried. I begged.
okay, okay. But um, what I learned through my networks here in Manitoba, and it'll be the same in other provinces, was that the government essentially simply handed over the entire government to the public health officer, which is just bizarre.
Mhm.
And again, it gets back to, you know, not the sharpest political class potentially, not having the capacity to look at alternatives. I did talk with somebody in Manitoba who had responsive, well, it was part of their portfolio, and he just said for some reason I thought it should go to to that branch. Suddenly, it was being run by Brent Rusin, and again, it was a total gong show,
Mhm.
and and we now look at it, and you know this is pretty tough, but you know, we saw 15 days to flatten the curve end up being 2 years long. We saw enormous damage. We saw people being killed by these policies, and yet they continued to go on and on and on. And you look at it and say, well, you know, you had the information by May or June that this is not a good thing, but you kept going for 2 years. You knew that you're causing enormous damage. You didn't do any due diligence. This is a big problem, and again, it's a very touchy topic, but this has to be investigated. I think there's a good case there was criminal negligence involved here, and people need to be held responsible for what happened. Okay,
Mhm.
and I would go farther and say people need compensation for what happened. So
Yeah, this is you used the word bizarre, and one example is in the Gateway decision, of course, that the Gateway case that occurred in Manitoba, where you had the sitting chief medical officer, Dr. Rusin, on one side of the case, and then the other side you have his mentor, uh, the Dr. Kettner, and they completely disagree on what was the
yeah,
proper public policy. So they're both public servants in outgoing, incoming,
yeah.
and they're totally disagreeing. Of course, it's the public that's the that is the loser. And on the topic of an investigation and the and compensation, I know that one of the many ideas that has been talked about a lot on the frontier is the COVID commission. That's something we talked about with Preston Manning. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and its
Sure.
importance?
Sure. Well, I am not exaggerating, Leighton, when you could say this is the biggest public policy fiasco in history. Okay, and we're about to put out a book on this, in September, and again, I was joking saying, is this crime of the century? They said, no, this is the crime of the eon. Um, and we have all sorts of good information now that you know uh, you know, 25 times to 46 times the costs were say 46 times greater than any benefit. Yet they kept going, and they caused enormous damage. And again, yeah, I did try to reach out to Kettner. I never managed to get through to him, but he was ignored. Um, and on all these things, masks don't work, but it's it's out there. Um, and now we look at it, and it's alarming that the vaccines don't work. Okay, they don't prevent transmission. They don't prevent infection. And the data now coming out is that if you are vaccinated, in fact, your chances of death are higher than if you're unvaccinated. Um, Again, the numbers are there, the evidence is there, and you know we still have all this, let's call it mal policy. Now, our problem is that ultimately at the end of the day, it's the political class that I think stumbled into this, and are they going to investigate themselves when there is a case that there should be severe penalties? I don't think that's very likely. Okay, and we need a royal commission. We need, as Preston Manning said, some kind of a credible independent commission to look at this, and you're not going to get it from the political class. So, we were happy to work with Preston Manning in terms of publishing his idea of a citizens commission, which there is still a discussion going on that they did a test run in Toronto back in June. And again, if anybody's interested, you can go to the website citizensinquiry.ca to get it. It's also posted at the Frontier website, and we have written summaries, and we have the videos you can watch, 3 days of people talking about all the problems with this particular response of lockdowns plus vaccines. And again, to me, it's been such an egregious thing that, I've been happy to make it a priority at Frontier that, that there has to be a discussion around this. And again, it's just it's a failure of the health system, a failure of the political system, a failure of the court system. And again, you've had plenty of guests on to dive into each of those. So
yeah, well, unfortunately, it seems to be an inexhaustible subject because it just goes on and on and on. Speaking about Preston Manning, though, one of the things that he's written about recently is, of course, and related to COVID is, of course, the truckers' convoy, the Freedom Convoy. And he described the imprisonment of Tamara Leach, the denial of bail, as unconscionable. And he just wrote a wonderful piece about this, which I believe was published in the Frontier as well. And thankfully, just yesterday, Tamara was finally released. She spent well over 40 days in jail now. I think she's exceeded the number of days that poor Pastor Coates served in jail and remand. And she's been released. And we had a judge actually say some sensible things that sounded sort of like things I would recognize as part of Canadian bail law. But what's your take on that Tamara Leach situation? Is it overstating it to say that she's a political prisoner, that she's being made an example of?
I think she was a political prisoner, and I think the treatment that the system has shown her has been despicable. And I fully agree with what Preston wrote, where he said at the end of the day, we need to find out who signed off on this and make sure that there are consequences for this. It's quite embarrassing for Canada. This whole COVID overreach has badly damaged Canada's brand around the world. We're just seen as a banana republic, and Tamara Leach is a Métis grandmother, and the whole trucker convoy, certainly that was a historic event, and it finally brought down the drastic overreach that was going on. And again, to me, I thought the trucker convoy and Tamara Leach and that they're all heroes as far as I'm concerned. Here we are. Like, I was in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is the coldest city in the world, over 500,000 according to some people. But I remember, if you know Headingley, which is a kind of a suburb of Winnipeg, we got in our car, drove out, and suddenly there were miles and miles of trucks coming in with flags and people on the overpasses, Canadians waving their flags. It was extremely touching. Okay, the political class had completely overreached, and basically you had a popular uprising going on. And at the end of the day, they ended the overreach that was going on. So Tamara Leach is a hero in my books. So,
speaking of heroes, I have to say that the frontier really has been a beacon for a lot of people of truth through the whole period of COVID. I can tell you many times when we were locked down, I went there to read articles and just to have a sense of people who are actually thinking clearly and looking at real evidence, real science, and questioning things was more than a comfort. It had a healing quality to it, and so I have to say, just to have the frontier, and it makes so much sense that you've resisted government sponsorship, because of course none of that would have been possible if you were beholden to them the way the legacy media people are, for example. So I want to say that as well. I think
well, Leighton, again, I think you're right, and again, there are think tanks out there. They've been around a long time, and you can tell whether there is a big government component to their budget, simply because they're going down the path of whatever the the policy flavor of the government of the day is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly we can get into the attack on energy.
We're going there.
The climate cult stuff. But again, it is if you have a substantial part of your budget out of the government, you get that phone call saying, you say that one more time, your budget falls by 25%. You learn to toe the line very quickly. Mm-hmm. Okay, and again, that's the advantage or power of the independent think tanks. And again, our issue is, of course, that the Americans have financially stronger independent think tanks than we do in Canada. So,
one of the great things about the frontier, though, that I've noticed, and of course the whole concept of a think tank can be daunting to some people. Maybe people are out there, they think, oh, think tank, it's all these intellectual eggheads. But one of the cornerstones, and there is some high level thinking there without question. But one of the cornerstones of the frontier is to have these ideas and sort of speak to an everyman audience. That's one of the cornerstones of the frontier, though, isn't it? You want to reach a large audience and as many people as possible, and to present ideas in a way that that is not alien to people who don't have have the whole alphabet soup behind their names. Right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, right. And again, our issue today is that we're in an environment where there's information overload, right? And so what we found is, a 700-word commentary is probably the most effective thing. People will read that. In the think tank world, you do need to do heavier lifting, longer studies and books. And again, Frontier has that as well. We have longer items. We have books. We just have there's a book coming out on universities next week. We have an update on our COVID book coming up in September. But again, you're not going to reach a giant audience with those. And it is an environment where you're competing with thousands and thousands of other places, right? And we have in the early days of Frontier, Frontier started off basically as a weekly newspaper column. That was it. And it got picked up, and it got picked up by more, and then the budgets grew, and we were able to, add more people, and we have a brand now that attracts, let's call them innovative thinkers, and we're very proud of let's call it the frontier intellectual team. A lot of them, though, they're very high-powered academics who just they don't fit into the woke environment out there, out in academia anymore. So they're happy to be at a place that lets them write. So
yeah, we've had a couple of those guys on our show. Of course, Dr. Salzman is one of them, and of course our good friend
McGill University,
yes.
Professor Emeritus. These are the smartest people in Canada. Okay,
off the chart. I mean, if there's a better research book on Indian residential schools than the one that Dr. Clifton wrote, I haven't seen it. But
even that topic, Leighton, it is the third rail. It is toxic to people, and diversity, climate change, all these things. You're just not allowed to talk to them now, or talk about them.
Speaking of climate change, let's draw you into your own controversy here. So I have here that some time ago you spoke about the Canadian public cool on climate change treaty and national polls, and you said some things. Climate changes are within natural levels of variability. Human-caused warming theories dominate public policy. You describe that there's clever rebranding, central planning agency, politicized science is now crumbling, new taxes on cheap, efficient energy sources that produce carbon dioxide. And so you are what many people would call a climate denier. And before we go into this, I first of all, it won't surprise you that I'm in your camp, but I'm a great fan of the Michael Crichton novels. So Michael Crichton wrote a book in the late 1990s called State of Fear.
Yes. Of course.
And so for those who haven't read it, it's a very prescient a plot line where basically there's a very corrupt environmental agency that is basically plotting to cause a dormant volcano to erupt using explosives, and they're going to use this as publicity to support a whole climate change agenda. And my favorite part of the book is actually when the actor, who I think was based on Robert Redford, conveniently falls out of a helicopter. Peter, let's dive into this because this is a very, very salient topic right now in Canada, especially for Western Canadians. We've got a crazed agenda from the federal government. Minister Gibault is talking about reducing oil and gas production by 46%. Canadian farmers are paying the cost of the Ukrainian-Russian war by 30% reduction of fertilizers coming in from Russia. Leslie Lewis, one of the front runners for the Canadian Conservative leadership, is talking about food shortages. This climate stuff is it's reaching the state of fear level that was talked about in the Crichton novel, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it's all unnecessary, and it's all based on a theory, the man-made theory of greenhouse gases and the idea of carbon pollution. There is a one-sentence way to knock this whole thing to pieces, which is carbon dioxide is not pollution. Okay, carbon dioxide is a beneficial trace gas, which they pump into greenhouses to make plants grow faster. And if you look at the big picture in terms of the reason they call it a trace gas is that there is very little of it in the atmosphere. And based on if you look back over geological history, we are at very low levels of carbon dioxide compared to hundreds of millions of years ago, where we had probably 15 or 20 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we do today. And if you recall the imagery of these big giant trees and big animals and a thriving environment, well, those were the times when there was lots of carbon dioxide. And we are at 400 parts per million or 425 parts per million. That is very small. And again, I'd be happy to I have one graph which shows there is really no connection between carbon dioxide levels and temperature. It goes back over, I think, 400 million years. And, the whole theory is essentially based on, the idea that carbon dioxide is a dangerous substance that needs to be managed, and we need to curtail emissions. Now, it's very, very convenient if you're a cultural Marxist and you want to degrade and collapse the capitalist economy, that coal and oil and natural gas, hydrocarbons, one of their byproducts is carbon dioxide. And again, my view is we need more carbon dioxide. So, what is the obsession with reducing carbon dioxide? It's convenient, though, because if you want to kill the market economy runs on hydrocarbons, on coal, on oil, on natural gas. It is reliable energy, and you can run a serious economy based on it. You cannot run an economy on intermittent wind and solar, and that's where the climate industry is going. That everything is supposed to run on windmills and solar. It's impossible. They've managed to, and again, this gets back to my point about a lack of policy capacity. It's pretty basic that things like net zero and so on, they're simply impossible things physically to do. Okay, you cannot get rid of hydrocarbons when it makes up 85% of the economy. It powers 85% of the economy, and you're seeing now what's going on in Holland and places where they're starting to go after the farmers and so on. And again, at the end of the day, it's a recipe for misery and despair. Sadly, the political class is so scared to get out of the box on this topic that they have their own kind of narrative that kind of works with climate change. And I have politicians or folks that I know that have a lot of respect for, but when they start talking about carbon capture or the hydrogen economy and so on, sorry, that's not an answer. And you need to just come out and say this is a false narrative. We won't accept it. Canada is a resource economy country. We have lots of energy resources. We should be the richest place in the world. And I think we should be the richest place in the world, but we have lots of bad public policy. And the one that is causing the biggest damage now is the obsession with getting out of fossil fuels and somehow running the place, where a bunch of central planners using this false theory, essentially trying to run everybody's life, and they're doing central planning. And I'm not sure, Patrick Moore. We have to get him on your show, Leighton. But
love to have him on the book.
Yeah, and Patrick Moore, we've been honored to have him involved at Frontier, and again, co-founder of Greenpeace, PhD scientist, He's written papers on, for Frontier. And again, what he will say to you very simply is that in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the whole philosophy of government planning and central planning essentially was discredited, that whole cohort moved over to the green file. And what are they doing? They're trying to run your lives. They're trying to tell you what car you can drive and how you can live and what you can eat and all that. It's completely ludicrous. Okay. And what we need is the political class to stand up and say, no, forget it. And that's where we are. I'm a guy, I'll tell you, climate is always changing. It never is a static thing. And I'll give you an example here in Winnipeg. It's quite funny. We have two measuring stations. One is at the Forks in downtown Winnipeg. And then there's a measuring station at the airport. And the airport is kind of on the edge of town in the middle of nowhere. It's an open prairie. Well, guess which one is 1.5 degrees warmer all the time? Can you guess, Leighton? It's the one downtown where there is an urban heat island because
Sure.
a bunch of people down there. But if you go to the edge of the city and where the prairies are, and it's always colder there. Okay. Now what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed is that a lot of the land-based measurement stations in Siberia, for example, were closed. And so you had a whole bunch of remaining stations that were in the cities that are always just a little bit warmer because of the heat island. And so they use that as an example of, we have global warming going on. No, you don't have global warming going on. And again, this is actually quite frightening, is that there is a lot of evidence that we are going to be seeing global cooling across the world and across Canada. Our winter last year was horrible. I'm guessing it was not that great at Cold Lake either. And
name.
Yeah, and again, Tim Ball, who was at the University of Winnipeg and is the go-to person on this. We would have him in to present, to sort of do an uptake on the climate wars, and he would always make the point that if you lowered the temperature in Canada by, I think it was a degree or a degree and a quarter or a degree and a half, you would close down the entire agriculture economy. Okay, so global cooling is a real big deal, and we should worry about that. But in terms of global warming, it is a racket, and I'm not embarrassed to call it out. And again, Frontier will call it out, and we publish lots of materials with numbers and facts in it. And will a government think tank down the road called the International Institute for Sustainable Development talk about this? Never. Okay. But they get $10 million a year or something. So
wow,
of your money.
And yours. The point that Patrick Moore makes about sort of the refitting of red communism into green environmentalism is very, very interesting, and it answers a question that I've had for a long time. That is, I can't figure out why a scientific problem, if it does exist, that is climate change, is always expressed in terms of economic ideology, and why it's always expressed as more. In other words, there's always an economic solution and an economic cause, namely capitalism, for this. And of course, it leads inexorably to this other problem, which is that people tend to listen more to a 16-year-old teenager from Sweden than they do to someone like Patrick Moore. I can tell you, I have a young person Greta's age in my house, and I only go to him for clarification when I want to understand rap music or when I can't figure out what my iPhone is doing. I'm not going up to him to solve major economic and world climate problems.
Well,
So,
if you dig down into Greta's background, of course, there were special interests involved who happened to be involved in the windmill business and the renewable business. Okay.
right.
And Greta was a marketing device. Okay. And again, we can talk about the media failing as they did on COVID, but the paper here in Winnipeg gets over half its money from Justin Trudeau. And surprise, surprise, they come out with an editorial policy a couple of years, well, probably 4 years ago now, and I have copies of it because it was so incredible that they just simply don't accept any other views that might be called denier views, and that man-made climate change is an established fact, and they won't publish anything else. Well, okay.
This stuff is really what we're talking about is, and part of what the frontier is dealing with is this attack on objective truth. So, for example, in the COVID situation and also on the environmental file, we've got the science versus science. So, for example, I was looking the other day at a picture of Plymouth Rock, which was laid in 1620, and the water level, that rock has never gone underwater. And also they've been measuring the water level in Sydney Harbor for over 140 years, and that hasn't moved at all. And I was looking at a meme, I have this in front of me the other day, hot UK summers, 1911, the highest temperature, 36.7 degrees Celsius, 2016, 34.4 degrees Celsius. And basically it goes through every 10 years, every decade, and really the temperature has not moved at all. In fact, if anything, as you say, over time it's cooled, which seems to be consistent with the reality that our sun is dying.
well, again, in the early 70s it was global cooling, and
I
you
remember
remember Time Magazine,
that.
glaciers, and so on. It then went to global warming, and I think in
Very quickly
1990,
global warming, right? It was like a
well,
switch.
well, yeah, 1998, but after 1998, the temperature didn't cooperate with the plot, and it wasn't warming, so they changed it to climate change. So today, you have a storm, you have whatever, and it just works. Anything works. There's a flood in Winnipeg. Well, it's climate change. No, you have floods here all the time. And the other thing is, you need to, be there's a real lack of sophistication. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and if you look at land-based measurements, where they have a thermometer and so on, those measurements go back 150 to 200 years. So when you hear it's the hottest in history, well, it's the hottest maybe in 150 years, but I guarantee you it's probably been hotter before then. But we don't have a record past 150 years. Okay. So.
And you know what's interesting too, Peter, is that as you were saying, the people who pay the closest attention, perhaps more than anyone, to the weather and to climate patterns are farmers. And they've got this thing called the Farmer's Almanac, and I think most farmers would be really excited about the idea that things are warming up, right? Because longer growing seasons, increased productivity. But as you say, they're not worried about that at all. They're worried about the trend going the other way, aren't they?
I have a friend who's in the bee business, and his issue this summer is a lack of heat units in this summer. The bees don't go anywhere if it's cold, and he's like exactly as you say, he wants it to be warm. Okay.
Wow.
And again, if you have colder temperatures, you'll have crop failures and so on here, but there's no discussion of that. But the whole thing where you've got a politician in Ottawa telling you what kind of car you're going to be driving in 2035, how you're going to live, what kind of food you're going to eat. This is just it's an impossible thing. And again, what we need is political leadership to come out and again, a lot of people don't like Trump, but Trump basically just said, "Hey, I don't care. I'm going to do these things," and he cranked up the energy sector, energy dominance. Good for him. And he wasn't kowtowing to the interest groups, and that's what's happening in Canada. Is you've got lots of interest groups pulling puppet strings with politicians on healthcare policy, on vaccination, on electric cars, whatever. Okay, and we need people to come in and just say, no, hey, let's go back. And maybe we can talk a little bit about this. What should governments be doing? Okay, anything the government touches, like the healthcare system. In Manitoba, we had 55 ICU beds. Well, okay, so you had a flu outbreak, and suddenly the system was collapsing, and there was headlines screaming on the front pages of the paper, and the CBC is going, and it's like an apocalypse. Everybody is sitting there going, "Oh my God, oh my God!" But the fact is, your system is very poor, and you should have more than 55 ICU beds. Okay, but that was never reported. Okay, and we have lots that we could be doing in terms of fixing healthcare. And again, I'm sure you could talk about improving the court system and so on. There's lots of opportunity for better public policy in Canada. Okay, and again, all I'm saying is, we should be having a great big discussion on this, and we should be using all the actors, including the independent think tanks.
Right. So we kept you quite a while here, but I have to ask you about one. I know you've written on a number of different topics, but there's one that's kind of near and dear to me that I really want you to talk about before we let you go, and that is this concept of UNDRIP. You've written about this, saying that it's seriously flawed and needs to be amended. I agree, but I'd love to hear your take on this. Maybe could you explain a little bit about what UNDRIP is and why it's such a concern to you and should be really of concern to all Canadians?
Well, I don't know. I haven't written about UNDRIP, Leighton.
Okay.
I would, we have Joseph Quinnell and a few other folks. I'll give you my understanding of it. And in fact, today we posted a great article, a great essay by Peter Best, talking about
right. That's the one I was talking about. Sorry, I didn't mean to catch you off guard.
Well, the parallels between New Zealand and Canada when it comes to this idea of sort of aboriginal self-governance, and essentially what is happening, and what I like in that, like there's actually a podcast out of New Zealand which I recommend to people. But they said that under the United Nations program, that essentially they are going to, in New Zealand, the Maori population makes up 17% of the population. The rest of the population, is 83%, and what they are going to do is give them effectively co-governance, so that the 17% have the same power as the 83%. And basically, what comes out of it is that if you start dividing your society by ethnic groups and so on, you end up going down a very troubled track. And a lot of countries that have done that have failed, and that's kind of where we are going. And again, Peter Best, in fact, I'd recommend you get Peter Best to come on your program.
We have talked about one of his books on the program. I know that.
and the issue of Section 35 in the Constitution, et cetera, which essentially makes the idea of the First Nation being equal to let's say regular government. There's big problems with that. And again, I haven't written about it myself, but there's lots of material at Frontier on that topic.
Yeah. One of the things that concerns me about it is that Of course, I don't like really anything that's coming out of the UN these days, but
No.
when you look at UNDRIP, first of all, people should know that the federal government is about to have this brought into Canadian law, have it adopted, and it's very vague, and it's very non-specific, and it looks like a Trojan horse that would surrender sovereignty completely
Yep.
to people who are unelected and who are not and we're not answerable. So it's a complete, I would say, perversion of representative democracy in Canada. And of course, that's very consistent with just about everything that the UN is doing these days. And
Yeah.
so that's why I mentioned it. It seems to fly in the face of many of the principles that the frontier stands for.
Well, and it's, talk about the bio-fascist state with the World Health Organization coming in, being able to do things. And the climate thing is an absolute disaster. If again, it's an attack on a capitalist society. And I agree with you. The UN is typically bad news these days on any file, as far as I'm concerned.
So we have this sort of confluence of all these different streams. We've talked about a lot of them here, a lot of the topics that are discussed and elaborated upon on the Frontier website. We talked a little bit about racism. We talked about diversity, inclusion, equity. We've talked at length about COVID and, of course, environmental scare. There's more, of course. There's the corruption of the media. We talked a little bit about that. So, Peter, just taking sort of the 10,000-foot view here, what is really going on in Canada? What we seem to be witnessing, the devolution of the freest, most, the best place in the world to live. It seemed like the day before yesterday, and now, as you say, internationally, we have people looking at Canada saying, "What the heck is going on? What's happening in our country?" What's the big picture agenda that you think is happening in Canada right now?
I trace it back, Leighton, to a federal government that is way out of its lane. You should, the feds should be doing stuff that feds do, which is foreign affairs, military, Trans-Canada Highway, enforcing free trade between the provinces. But wherever the feds are involved, it's basically, pardon me, a shit show. Okay. Healthcare. Healthcare it's a joke. And again, it has to do with federal interference. Saying you have to run it like the Bulgarian post office if you want money from the federal government. Okay, the climate thing, the attack on the energy sector, the resource sector, based on the climate stuff. To me, again, that is it's federal. It's a space where the feds just shouldn't be. Okay, they are. If you look under the present government, they've expanded the civil service by 25% since 2015. It is the level of government farthest from the people, and it's basically it's expanding based on people are not being brought into the federal government based on competence and merit. Okay, they are being hired based on external characteristics and who they sleep with and so on. So you have a fundamentally incompetent level of government that is dominating Canada now, and I think the answer is you have to drastically dial back the feds and get them out of all sorts of spaces. And again, my problem is, there's been so much damage done that you have to come in, hit the ground running, and you need to make large cuts to spending and do some real public policy reform. Get out of healthcare, replace equalization with something that is workable. going back to the climate file, I get people saying to me, well, climate change is real, et cetera, et cetera. And I go, well, don't think for a second that Alberta and Saskatchewan are going to sit around while some dilettante from Ottawa arrives to close down the economy. They're simply going to leave. Don't you get it? And this is a recipe for breaking up the country. Okay, they don't seem to get it, but that's where it will go. And again, at the end of the day, whatever happens, but like at Frontier, we do have a discussion of what is high performance government versus low performance government. It's kind of technical, but I would guess that Alberta would be extremely successful, and hopefully that they would adopt principles of high performance government. And you know what? If you want to, do the climate destruction, guess what? You're basically just going to run out of money because money will disappear. So
that's a great place to leave off in terms of where we need to go to affect change. Well, Peter, we've taken a lot of your time. We're so grateful for it. We know you're a very, very busy guy. This is the part of the program that you're familiar with, and I know you're loaded up and ready to go with a trio of book for us. This is the reading list. We've already talked about one, the bonus item. That was the book that you and I both seem to admire. That State of Fear by Michael Crichton. That book is very easily found anywhere you buy books. It's also available if you like audiobooks. In fact, I listened to it in that form. I also read it in written form because I liked it so much. But my book, I'm going to let Peter finish off because he's got a whole reading list there for us unto himself. But the book that I'm going to recommend is written by somebody that I know Peter and I both admire. That's the late Dr. Roger Scruton, British intellectual historian, also Cambridge-educated lawyer. Really, just one of these incredible polymathic minds that seem to know so many things and be able to talk about almost any topic authoritatively, everything from wines to, in this case, the environment. He wrote a wonderful book called How to Think Seriously About the Planet, The Case for Environmental Conservatism. And this is a book that I like very much because it talks about the environment as having long been the disputed territory of the political left, which cast international capitalism, consumerism, and the overexploitation of natural resources as the principal threats to the planet and sees top-down interventions as the most effective solution. But what Dr. Scruton does is he doesn't necessarily get down into the weeds and take on the left on their own ground. What he does do is he says actually that no large-scale environmental project, however well-intentioned, will succeed if it's not rooted in small-scale practical reasoning. And this is all framed in one of his, let's say, one of his philosophies, which is called oikophilia, love of home. And essentially his point is one that has been stated many times by other thinkers, and that is the people are going to do a much better problem or a much better job of solving virtually any problem at a local level by getting together, working together, thinking about ideas, sharing ideas, and collaborating. They're going to do a much better job of solving virtually any problem than a government, especially a big government.
And the public policy term for that, Leighton, is subsidiarity. Very, very important. You need to move power as close to the people as possible.
Right.
Exactly.
That's the kind of thing that Preston Manning talks about too, right?
Yes.
Where his will do something, right?
And again, the most distant, least competent level of government, the federal government, is where all the chaos and damage is happening in Canada. Okay.
Right, because they're so far from the problem, and so it's so easy for them just to get lost in their ideology, right?
You have these sort of, woke dreamers, impractical, and they're inflicting their impractical ideas on everybody, and they're causing lots of damage.
Right. They're totally disconnected from, let's say farmers in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, for example. Okay, so let's come to you. It's your turn.
Okay. Well, all right. We didn't talk about Margaret Thatcher, but and I actually met Margaret Thatcher in 2002.
Really?
And it
Wow.
was kind of like you're meeting God. What do you say? Like, hi, good job. But she when she came in, and again, I think we have parallels between, when Margaret Thatcher came in, the British economy was in big trouble. And I think that's where we are in Canada. And we need a Margaret Thatcher moment here. But she required all her cabinet ministers to read a book called Yes, Minister. And Yes, Minister, there's actually a TV show that was done by I think it was the BBC. And it basically is a story of how the bureaucracy runs circles around elected officials. Okay. And it is it's a funny book, but in fact, it was, it had lots of things in it that do apply. The call it the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy has its own interests, and the politicians kind of come and go. And again, we need to break. How do we make this work better? But Yes, Minister is a marvelous book if you're operating in politics. Okay, Thomas Sowell, probably in my view, the most esteemed economist out there right now. He wrote a book called Knowledge and Decisions, which is a big book. It's a magnum opus. It's his crowning work. It's a long book, but it essentially talks about spontaneous order and how market economies work based on dispersed knowledge and people voluntarily interacting with each other. It's a fabulous book. It's a bit of a hard read, but if you're into Thomas Sowell, that is his marquee book in my view.
And he's got a think tank, right? The Hoover Institute.
He is. And he's kind of shy. He doesn't really get out much. But the next book it's a book called Capitalism by Arthur Seldon, Seldon. And Arthur Seldon was one of the intellectual powerhouses at the Institute for Economic Affairs, which was the original free market think tank in London, which ended up advising Margaret Thatcher. Arthur Seldon, this book, it might be hard to get, but it is a fantastically readable discussion of the market economy and capitalism. Okay. And I'll throw in one more if you don't mind.
No, absolutely.
And it's the climate change one. If you want the ultimate takedown, there's a book called Green Murder by Ian Plimmer, who is a scientist out of Australia. And Green Murder it's just packed with information, and it will essentially show you what a racket the climate change mafia thing is. It again, these are things that you can get on Amazon, and highly recommended. So those are my 4 books for you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for adding to our reading list. By the way, for anybody who's interested, on the website there is a reading list, a cumulative list, an anthology, if you will, and it's growing. It's growing quickly. It's growing exponentially because of Peter. So Peter, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. I knew we would have a great conversation, and of course, you've exceeded my best hopes. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your knowledge, and your books. And we look forward to having you back if you would at some time in the future to talk more about the work that the Frontier Center, the very important work that the Frontier Center is doing, the very unique work that Frontier Center is doing. And again, one more plug to anybody who hasn't seen it, check out the website. It's just incredible. It's one of the best places where you can go to find information about the truth about what's going on in Canada and in the world. and you'll be astonished at what you find there. It's just some of the most brilliant people. And I'm not saying that because they publish my stuff there. I would say I'm at the low end of the pool. Much smarter people than me publish their stuff there. It's really worthwhile. So check it out.
Well, we're honored to have you in the loop, Leighton, and we do repost the Gray Matter podcast because they're very good, and I commend you for that. And again, at the end of the day, I think we live in a great place. This should be the most successful country in the world, and you and I can help us get there. And again, I think people need to get involved. And as we say, it's a bit of a cliche. Ideas have consequences. Today, there are lots and lots of bad ideas in Canada, and we need to replace those ideas. So thanks for helping with that project, Leighton.
Thank you. That's a wonderful way to conclude the show, Peter. Thanks again for being with us today on Gray Matter.
Thank you.